So
starting the webinar.
We're
Ready?
starting, right? Okay. Hello, welcome to Climate Restoration. We will be starting in a few minutes. We are just waiting for a few more people to join. Welcome to our webinar on climate restoration. Just taking a couple more minutes. Okay, we're just waiting for a couple more people to join. Welcome to Climate Restoration. What exactly is it, and is it even possible, by the CLIO Institute? So the CLIO Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization. We focus on science, impacts, and solutions to the climate crisis. And we're very, very happy to be here today with the Foundation for Climate Restoration and to be hosting this webinar today. Here is a little more information about CLIO coming up here.
I want you to ask yourselves those tough questions, the ones we avoid: how we want to live, what do we want for our children, what do we want for our planet?
Our atmosphere is so finely tuned for what we need. We're treating it like a dumping ground, a sewer. The health impact of climate change is a global problem, and we see the results of that on a local level.
If we fail to act now, then we will leave behind a fundamentally degraded planet for our children and grandchildren, a planet that resembles the futures that have been portrayed in dystopian Hollywood films: unprecedented inundation of our coastlines, droughts, floods, heat waves, superstorms. That's the future that we will see if we fail to act on climate.
The CLIO Institute was founded in 2010 with the drive to educate and empower South Floridians to act on climate. Founded by Caroline Lewis, a science teacher by training, her vocation led her to understand what was causing people's apathy towards the glooming climate crisis: knowledge.
We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction.
Today, the CLIO Institute is the #1 nonprofit organization for climate education, engagement, and advocacy. Through programs like the CLIO Speakers Network, CLIO trains people to become climate speakers by breaking down the science, impacts, and solutions. CLIO's educational efforts are backed by a world-class expert advisory council of scientists, environmentalists, teachers, and government officials. While the world is already feeling the impacts of our changing climate, not everyone is feeling it the same way. CLIO is a leader in the climate justice movement, providing the resources and tools to the most vulnerable communities in South Florida that are on the front lines of the climate crisis.
I wanted to be an outreach for them.
Building communities' resilience through women is the cornerstone of our Empowering Resilient Women program. By teaming up with community members like the YWCA, CLIO is able to empower and educate women on how better to prepare for more extreme weather events like hurricanes while building community. CLIO works to remove barriers and build a wider coalition to fight climate change across faith-based communities, elected officials, and municipalities, schools, and cultural organizations. One of the most important voices that CLIO continues to amplify is that of our youth.
What do we want? When do we want it?
Their Gen CLIO program meets regularly with students across the region, training them to be climate ambassadors in their schools and communities.
Dear elected officials,
this is a crisis. Do your job. We'll be watching.
CLIO recently launched its Climate Resilient Schools initiative to bring their program into the classrooms while building a robust climate curriculum for Miami-Dade public schools. CLIO continues to expand its engagement through multimedia outreach, including television commercials, social media, and billboards. With statewide campaigns like the Florida Climate Pledge,
I care about climate change, and I care about climate change because it affects everybody, regardless of race, culture, and ethnicity. Because I'm passionate about the success of my future.
I like the CLIO Institute because it takes the time to educate people about the importance of climate change and the things that we can do to improve our world.
you can have your voice heard too. Fund our climate action work today. The future of Florida is in your hands.
I want you to ask yourself.
Hi. So we're here today to talk about climate restoration. Very, very excited to have the Foundation for Climate Restoration with us here today. And today we are hosting this from the CLIO Institute. And Laura Betts is our Orlando office program manager. And I'm the associate programs manager for the Orlando CLIO Institute. And Laura's going to take us through a little housekeeping.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to let you know that a recorded version of this webinar will be available after the webinar. And we will also be providing you information, the contact information for our guests. After the presentation, there will be time allowed for question and answer. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions, and please feel free to add your questions at any time during this presentation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. And we're also joined by Peter Fikowski, founder of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. He is an MIT-trained physicist and entrepreneur with 27 patents, and very happy to have him here. And also Erica Dodds, COO of the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and she has a PhD in interdisciplinary evaluation and an MA in International Development Administration. So very happy to have both of them walk us through the progress that the Foundation for Climate Restoration has made. I believe that there's going to be some very interesting information here. And this is an organization I feel is doing some really wonderful work that's very important to shine a light on. So let's take it away. Yeah, Erica, whenever, I'll stop the share.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Aria, and thank you for having us. We're really excited to be here. And as much as we love listening to ourselves talk, and we really do, we much prefer to hear your questions and be in dialogue. So at any time, please do ask questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to those as quickly as we can. All right, so as Aria mentioned, we are with you from the Foundation for Climate Restoration, and to the best of our knowledge, we're the only organization in the world devoted entirely to restoring the climate. So we're going to tell you what that means and some of the ways that we can do that, and then what our strategic approach is at an organization. So the first thing to note is that there's no one in the world who's actually accountable for the survival of humanity, which may be counterintuitive, but we have a lot of organizations and governmental entities that have different responsibilities, but no one's responsibility is the survival of humanity, which is kind of alarming when you realize the position that we're in, where it's been several million years since we've had CO2 levels as high as they are now. And of course, CO2 is one of the main warming gases that's causing our climate to change. And the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when CO2 goes into the atmosphere, when you burn fossil fuels, it doesn't just dissipate pretty quickly, it stays there for a long time. So from the time that we exceeded safe levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, it was no longer ever going to be enough to just reduce emissions. We had to, work on the legacy emissions that are in the atmosphere causing the warming. So I have a little bit of a video to illustrate that more. So for the last several decades, our climate action has had two main pillars, mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is focused on reducing emissions, and adaptation is focused on having us learn how to survive in this warming, changing world that we've created. And the Foundation for Climate Restoration is devoted to adding a third leg to that stool, focused on restoration, which is dealing with the legacy carbon dioxide and getting us to a climate that we know is safe and healthy for humanity and our natural world. So we like to use this, this analogy of a bathtub. So for the last several million years, we've had this bathtub where Earth has been swimming in a healthy level of CO2. But with the Industrial Revolution, we turned on this faucet that brought a lot more CO2 into the atmosphere. And like I mentioned, that CO2 doesn't just go away. So while mitigation efforts have focused on turning off that faucet, turning off the faucet won't get rid of the excess CO2 that's already in the atmosphere, causing our Earth to drown. So climate restoration is focused on opening the drain so we can get that excess CO2 out and get back to what we know to be safe and healthy levels. As I mentioned, or might have mentioned, I actually don't remember already, the specific goal that we have for climate restoration is to get below 300 parts per million by the year 2050. We're currently at about 417 parts per million, which is exceptionally high. So this is an ambitious goal. You might have heard the number 350 thrown around. That's often what's considered to be a pretty safe level, but even that is substantially higher than humans have ever survived long term. So we figure, why roll the dice? Let's get back to a pre-industrial level of CO2, which we know humans can survive long term along with our natural world. I'm going to pass it to Peter to talk a little bit more about what this could look like.
Yeah. So for a long time, I wondered if it was possible, it should be possible to remove the excess CO2. And a lot of you have seen this graph or variations of it many times in the last 3, 4, 5 years. This is CO2 over the last million years, and it's gone up and down. When the CO2 level goes down, that's an ice age. So today is here, and this goes backwards in time. The area here is the last ice age, 12,000 years ago. So not that long ago. You can imagine a mile of ice over New York City. You can see that that nature has removed the amount of CO2 we need to remove 10 times in the last million years. So this going into this ice age and this ice age and this 10 times. And so that's really good news to know that nature knows how to do it even without engineering or thinking or planning. And we actually know how nature does it, that the CO2 goes into the ocean and then the currents and things change and then it comes back out into the air. And we know the process that allows the photosynthesis to sequester carbon from the air and bury it as carbon in the ocean. So over time, you can see, unfortunately, it's not, anyway, I was hoping for a slightly different right side. Ignore the right side here. This is confusing. But the arc here is today. So we
can't see your cursor, by the way. So
oh, you can't see my cursor? Oh,
no.
You can see your cursor. Oh,
Am
I
I in the right place?
Okay, good. So yeah, so show them where today is.
Here?
No, well,
No.
Today is, yeah, it is down at the bottom of the curve, at the knee of the curve. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's not going to go well. Okay, well, let's skip this one because it's going to be too hard. So one of the interesting things about well, we all know that CO2 emission is the main cause of climate change, is the carbon in the air. And one of the things that we often forget is it's actually people. And this is a simple graph of the global population from 1800 to today. And you can see that our CO2 emission really matches the population. And so when it comes to what can an individual do, the most powerful thing that an individual can do is have a smaller family, have 1 or 2 kids rather than 2 or 3. Because most of us are not going to get 1 million or 1 billion tons of CO2 out of the air. Although we'll talk about a little bit of policy that can help organizations do that.
Great. So as Peter mentioned, we have a really good idea of how nature goes about removing huge quantities of CO2 from the atmosphere. So we found that the most promising solutions out there to deal with the excess CO2 that we have currently are based on nature's methods. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those later on. And Peter's already addressed the question of, is it possible? But just to give another concrete example showing that we know that it is physically possible to remove the excess CO2, you might have heard of direct air capture, and that's a process by which machines blow air through them or let air pass through them, and carbon dioxide bonds to something in the machine so that that carbon dioxide is removed from the air, and then you can do something with it. So one of these companies is called Climeworks, and they take CO2 that they capture from the air and they pump it underground in Iceland into basalt fields, which is a type of mineral. And that carbon dioxide mineralizes, turns to rock with that basalt, so it is permanently sequestered. So there's no limit to the number of these machines that could be built. We could build enough of them to sequester all trillion tons of CO2 by the year 2050. We don't think this is the way to go because it does cost money and a lot of man hours to do something like this, but it's just an example that we already have technology that could, in theory, do the physical task at hand. But there are a lot of ideas out there, and so as an evaluator, my question is always, how do we decide what's a good solution? What's a solution that's fit to the problem? So we have 3 criteria that we use to look at whether something is a good fit for a climate restoration solution. The first is that carbon stays securely out of circulation for at least a century. And the reason that we mention this is that there are a lot of solutions out there that are not permanent. So things like putting carbon dioxide into soda, as long as your bottle is sealed, it'll stay there for a good long time. But once you consume your beverage, it's released again. So we're looking for things more like mineralization, turning carbon dioxide into rock, that really change the state of the CO2 and keep it sequestered permanently. So secondly, we have scalability. There are 1 trillion tons of excess CO2 in the atmosphere. And so something that has a small commercial market or that's really hard to do at large scale is not going to make a big dent in the problem. So we look for solutions that can remove and store about 25 gigatons, like 25 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. That way, over the course of 2030 to 2050, when we want to see several solutions operating at scale, we can get to the 50 gigaton per year scale that we think is needed in order to restore the climate by 2050. Finally, we have financeability. So I mentioned that the Climeworks solution costs money, and a lot of these solutions do. They can be very expensive. There are a lot of ideas out there that look great, have a lot of co-benefits, but someone has to pay for them, and it's often not clear who will be able to do that. So our primary focus at this time is on solutions that are commercially viable and have large existing markets. I always give the example of carbon nanotubes or diamonds. These are things that people will pay a lot of money for. They're valuable commercial goods that could sequester carbon. However, we just don't use enough of them to get 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide out of circulation. And then, of course, implicit in all of this is safety. We don't want to be doing anything at large scale that is going to do harm or more harm than good. And yet, it's important to realize that the situation with the climate is pretty dire. So saying that it's better to do nothing than to do something that could be harmful is no longer a smart way to go. We need to be comparing the risk of inaction. You know, what will the world look like if we do nothing in 30 years compared to the potential risks of action? So I just went through a decent amount of material. I have a little bit more. This is just to let you know, all of this information is on our website, f4cr.org/whitepaper. And that'll take you to our resources page. I'll mention that again later on in the presentation. You can find a lot more information about everything we're discussing here and more. So now I'm going to move into our approach as an organization. We are a convening organization, and our focus is to create the ecosystem needed for climate restoration to succeed. The reason we think about it this way is that when we started out talking about climate restoration, we thought, okay, well, if the solutions are out there that can do this, that can restore our climate, then clearly all we need to do is help them scale up. And when we started working on this, we realized that it's kind of a vicious cycle, that the scientists need research dollars, and the research dollars come from policymakers, and for policymakers to decide to fund the kind of research that would allow climate restoration to take off takes public demand. So the public needs to be educated that this is a possibility that they should advocate for. So we have 3 pillars of our work, and of course, the communications, outreach, and partnerships underpin all of that and all towards our vision of restoring the climate. So we have a complicated network of initiatives that we're taking on. I'm just going to point to a couple of them. So in the education side, we have an annual climate restoration forum. If you're interested in learning more, we would love to have you join us. This year's forum is in about 3 weeks. It's on September 15th and 16th. I will mention that again later, but you can sign up for registration alerts on our website, f4cr.org. And once registration opens early next week, you'll be able to register there as well. We're also working on a youth initiative to allow young people to ask their policymakers, ask their representatives, and ask other young people and youth organizations to call for a climate that they know they can survive, that's safe and healthy for them and future generations. We're working across faiths with faith leaders from Catholics to Jews to Muslims all over the world to have them call for climate restoration and restoring our common home. We have a partnership of corporations, government entities, nonprofits, and more that's working on carbon removal for the purpose of climate restoration. We have local governments and local chapters supporting those local governments because there's a lot of opportunity at the local level to implement policy that can support climate restoration. And finally, on the solutions side, we have both ocean-based and land-based solutions, resources that we're developing to empower people working in these areas to take their work forward more quickly and with all of the resources they need. So with all of that said, I'm going to highlight just 2 solutions. There are more out there and there are more good ones out there, but these are the easiest to explain quickly and give you something to take home. So first is synthetic limestone. We've mentioned that that carbon sequestration should be scalable, financeable, and permanent. And synthetic limestone is one of the relatively few things that fits the bill. Humans use more rock than anything on Earth other than water. So it's a massive global market. It's about 50 billion tons per year and growing quickly. So 2 companies actually, Blue Planet, another one called Carbonate Systems in the UK, use different methods to combine CO2 with calcium to create synthetic limestone that is carbon negative. And this synthetic limestone can be used in concrete, in road beds, anything where you use rocks and sand. So, and as I mentioned, that's such a massive market. It's a commercial product. And in addition to being meeting all three of our criteria. It also saves transportation costs because it can be produced in a lab much closer to the end use point. And it reduces the need for quarries. So the degradation of landscapes that comes with that can be avoided with synthetic limestone. And secondly, we have marine permaculture arrays or kelp forests. So Climate Foundation is one of the pioneers of the solution. They use underwater lattices on which they seed kelp to grow kelp forests in the deep ocean. And they feed the kelp with upwelling. So they take these really long pipes that use the action of waves or solar power to pump water from the deep ocean up towards the surface. That deep ocean water is much more nutrient dense and it's cooler. So it creates a really nice environment for kelp and other marine life. And when you plant a forest, there's always the risk that it will burn down and release all of its CO2 or a lot of its CO2. When you plant an underwater forest, you lose that risk. And so there's still the risk of kelp dying, but when they do that, they fall towards the deep ocean where their carbon is sequestered for hundreds to thousands of years. So finally, very quickly, as an organization, we have a 3-phase strategy. We're at the tail end of the first phase right now, which is declaring a decade of climate restoration and forging a coalition to carry it out. Next, we are working more on the solution side, finding out what are the solutions that can get us to our goal, and how do we pilot, implement, and scale them so as they get to what we're calling restoration scale, that's 50 gigatons per year of carbon removal by the year 2030, so that by 2031 to 2050, all of these solutions can operate at scale and we can reach a safe and healthy climate by the year 2050. Okay, now what? I hope you're asking yourself. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and Peter is going to mention a few more after this. So I mentioned you can register for the second annual Climate Restoration Forum on our website, f4cr.org. You can ask us some questions in just a minute, and I hope you have a lot of them. I encourage you to read our white paper, which again is f4cr.org/resources or /white paper. Just go to our website, you'll find it pretty easily. One of the biggest things you can do right now is to help us spread the word. So share the idea of climate restoration with your friends. We have a lot of videos on our website, so you can see some of what we've been up to. We have a pledge you can sign to declare your commitment to climate restoration and to stay engaged in the movement. Definitely consider donating to organizations like the CLIO Institute that are doing such fantastic work on climate. We also take donations. And then on social media, you can follow us and follow the CLIO Institute. Make sure that you stay up to date on what's going on in your community when it comes to climate. This one's Peter.
Okay, so I like to summarize it quite simply. As I said, a specific action that people can take, which is required for our planet to stay livable, is to have small families. Remember that we have 10 times the number of people we had before the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. Think about that. So encourage your families to have just 1 or 2. Second is to remind our leaders that we want a proven, safe, and healthy climate. We have lots of tools for working on the climate. And for me, it's sort of like from here in California to get to New York, I can have a really good car or several cars and a motorcycle. But until I set the GPS to New York and a date, let's say September 1st, I'm just not going to get there. And so our leadership has been calling for climate action, and we've been building lots of machinery and financing. Next is to actually say we want to restore the climate, and that will mobilize everything that's needed. And then to be more specific, if you actually work in policy, if you're an advocate at your city, for example, work with us to generate policy that calls for using carbon negative building materials. So 99% of the carbon on our planet is sequestered in limestone. That's nature's way of storing carbon. And we can make this company, Blue Planet Limited, here in California, make synthetic limestone. They're licensing the technology. And when cities and nations require that new construction use carbon sequestering building materials, mostly concrete, then that actually can remove enough carbon to get our CO2 back to safe levels again. So that's my word of advice. But as I said, the first thing is to get very serious. People say, well, should I become vegan? You should definitely become vegan if that calls to you. And remember that if you're a young person, having one fewer child has 100 times the carbon impact of being vegan the rest of your life. So, it saves resources for the rest of the planet.
Great.
Go ahead.
This is just a small group of our partners. One last plug for the second annual Climate Restoration Forum, September 15th to 16th. You can sign up for registration alerts at f4cr.org, and I'll pass it back to Aria.
Great, thank you so much, Erica and Peter. So yeah, we have a couple questions coming in, and I'm just going to dig into this one. Or Laura, do you want to try to take this question from Doug? Okay, I'll take it. So as cumulative, and I hope I'm understanding this question properly, but I'll just read it. As cumulative carbon dioxide drawn down from the atmosphere and ocean rises toward the trillion-ton goal, waving a hand up and to the right, I'm not sure what that means, but how do you envision a proxy metric? Intensifying of storms, droughts, sea level, temperature, etc., will decline. Waving hand down to the right, about when would the climate be restored by some proxy metric?
Oh, I can take that.
Okay, good.
and Doug Grant's a good friend of mine, so Doug, it's great to have you on the conference here.
Yeah.
What Doug is essentially asking is this going to work as quickly as we think it might? And there are two answers. The first answer is probably yes. And the second answer is no one's done a study to answer it analytically. But those of us who are my age remember the Mount Pinatubo volcano in 1991. And the ash from that cooled the planet by a whole degree for about a year. And but the point is, it took a few months for the effects of that, which was reflecting sunlight, to cool the planet. So as soon as if we get the CO2, and I'm committed that we will, if we get the CO2 back below 300 by 2050, by 2050 the hurricanes and storms will have returned back to normal. Now, and I'm working to find the scientists who will do the analysis to demonstrate the intuition.
Okay, so I had a question as well. So what are the biggest barriers to restoring the climate right now? What would you say?
I think one of the biggest barriers is just inertia. We've been working on this global strategy of emissions reduction for how many decades? And as I mentioned, when we passed the threshold of 350 parts per million in 1988, which is honestly before I was born, at that point, it was no longer ever going to be enough to restore a safe and healthy climate just by reducing emissions. And we haven't reduced emissions, we've increased them steadily. So, there are so many brilliant people who are committed to the well-being of our planet, of our people, and who have done brilliant work and devoted their careers to emission reduction. So finding a way to introduce climate restoration in a way that doesn't minimize the importance of mitigation and adaptation, which remain absolutely critical. That tap is still on full blast and increasing. So allowing people who've devoted their careers to the existing climate strategies while bringing this new idea in is really challenging. Plus, most people have no idea that it's possible. We've approached the climate from the scientific perspective, where we aim to predict and describe what's going on. And we've gotten really good at predicting and describing what's happening with the climate. But that's not going to take us in a really new direction. It can give us some incremental changes, but even those have been politically very hard to implement. So climate restoration takes an engineering approach where we set the parameters for what it is that we want to achieve, and getting us onto that path that we've laid out is still very politically challenging, but I believe it's very doable. Peter, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, it really boils down to being clear about what we want. We're clear what we don't want, and we've been working for that. But if you're on the East Coast and you have snow, you know that if you get into a skid, they always tell you, don't look at the tree you want to avoid, look down the road, because that's you'll end up where you're looking. We've been staring at the tree and we're headed dead on into the tree. Well, the barrier is to get us to look where we want to go. And that's leadership. And that's what the CLIO Institute is for. And that's what our Foundation for Climate Restoration is for, is to keep focusing people's eyes on where we want to go. And it's very specific, getting the climate back, the conditions that we evolved for, that our agriculture is evolved for.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah.
Great answers, both of you.
Thanks.
So I have another question here. How is artificial lime rock, how does that compare to the regular lime rock in regards to cost? And why haven't cement and concrete industries adopted this technology yet?
That's for me. Yeah. So now, as you were reading that, one of the questions is, in terms of quality, the synthetic limestone is better because it's uniform. It's made from scratch, whereas in nature, you have all sorts of dirt coming from the quarry. In terms of cost, it varies. So the main cost of rock, anywhere you buy it, is the transportation. And so the synthetic limestone can be manufactured in the cities where it's needed. And the result is the projections from the financial analysts is that in most cases, the synthetic limestone will be less expensive than natural limestone. Here in California, it's a really big difference because much of our rock comes from British Columbia and Mexico, so it comes a long distance. But the other side of it is, if you look at a road, the cost of the rock in the road is less than 1% of the road. There's just a lot of labor involved and other materials. And so even in those cases where you have to ship the synthetic limestone a fair distance, and maybe it's double the cost of quarried rock, it still would only increase the cost of the road by less than 1%. So it's sort of similar to having to put up guardrails. So the approach that the people working on limestone are taking is to require carbon negative or synthetic rock in all roads and buildings. And it looks like there won't be any opposition. The extra cost is very little, if any. And people are happy to pay that in order to be assured that our children and grandchildren have a planet they can live on.
So I just want to emphasize this follow-up question as well. Why haven't any of the industries adopted this technology yet?
Oh, very simple. It's new. And so the major cement companies are rapidly learning about it, investing in it, and governments are rapidly learning about it and developing language to require it. And so in the next 3 or 4 years, you'll see a lot of it. There's been no particular objection other than, again, Erica pointed out how there's a scientific perspective of predicting the future, and scientists can't predict that synthetic limestone will succeed because there's no data for that. And so insofar as we do climate as a scientific endeavor, most of the scientific advisors don't recognize synthetic limestone as a viable future because it doesn't exist in the past.
Right.
Yeah, and that is changing rapidly.
Makes sense. Glad to hear of the progress.
Yes.
So also,
this is from Blue Planet, and this is just a whole bunch of their synthetic limestone rocks.
It is great to have those in your hands, isn't it? It makes it real.
It does, it does.
Yes, it does. So also we have a question about the company. What is the name of a company with scalable technology for the carbon?
That's the Blue Planet. Yeah.
And I just want to add really quickly.
What's that?
I just wanted to add really quickly, Blue Planet is, as Peter mentioned, they will license their technology, so they won't be the only ones doing this. They're just the innovators here. But also we really annoy them because every time we mention synthetic limestone, people get so excited. I mean, we're so excited about it all the time too. And they're still pretty early. So they're opening their first commercial plant basically as we speak, which means that they're not at commercial production yet. So they're getting calls from architects and engineers and concrete manufacturers every day and having to turn them away and say, we're not ready yet. So just keep in mind, you'll be hearing a lot more about them over the coming years, but they're not at scale at this point.
And actually, you probably won't hear about Blue Planet. You'll hear about the Carbon Star rating. So they came up with something similar to Energy Star. When I buy a refrigerator or a washer, it has a little sticker which tells me how efficient it is. It's like a standardized way of measuring efficiency. They've developed, and Canada has now almost approved a standard way to measure carbon composition for building materials. And so the Carbon Star is going to be what you can ask your city or state or nation to use to ensure that that building materials pull carbon out of the air.
Looking forward to that.
Good.
Yes. So we have a...
Well, let me just add. So with that, if you're interested, Erica is the one to talk to. She's organizing the cities and states who are going to be developing the language for that.
Wonderful. Yeah. Very exciting developments for sure.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt you there.
No, perfect. So here's another question. What are your thoughts about when people say that soil carbon sequestration is the most significant way to mitigate climate change? So I would imagine she's probably talking about regenerative agriculture and things like that.
Yeah, one of the things that I like to point out all the time is that there are a lot of solutions out there that don't meet our criteria, but that we absolutely should be doing. So soil sequestration is probably one of those. The data on the permanence of the sequestration and on the scale are both kind of all over the map when you look at the research. So plus it's really hard to monitor the longevity of the sequestration in soil or how much has been taken out of the air in the first place. So there are a lot of factors there that are kind of unknown. Data is getting better, but we're still not at a point where we can say, yes, this is permanent and scalable. Financeability seems maybe possible, but again, there are a lot of different models for financing soil carbon sequestration, and none of them has been proven yet. So it's just a matter of time to see how that shakes out. However, when you have healthy soils, they sequester a lot more carbon. Same thing if you have healthy rainforests, if you have healthy grasslands, if you have, anything, any natural ecosystem that is in really good health sequesters way more carbon than those that don't. And there are all these side benefits, right? So carbon that's high in soil produces not only higher quantities of food, but more nutritious food, and you know, support all of the various ecosystems that should be surrounding your food. So like I said, it probably doesn't meet our criteria. Not totally sure yet, but it's definitely worth pursuing.
Great. So I have another question here from David P. From what depth do you suggest gathering cold water to provide kelp nutrition? And how many kelp locations are you suggesting?
Ooh, I'll do my best. So the depth is typically 1,000 feet. And it depends on where you are in the world. And the number of locations, it can be the artificial kelp forests, the marine permaculture arrays, they can be implemented anywhere in the ocean. It's a bit more efficient than general plankton growth. And so about 1% of the ocean would be required to be covered to remove all of the excess CO2 by the year 2050, which is not too much, right? 1% of the whole ocean surface. It's one of the more expensive approaches that we have, but kelp is the most efficient photosynthesis machine on the planet. So it's a good way to go in that manner.
If you have an opportunity to watch the film 2040, or if you've already seen it, you would have seen Brian von Hertzen from the Climate Foundation featured on that film. And it's really remarkable. You know, he talks about the success that they've seen with their pilot kelp forests. He talks about how areas of the ocean that were completely devoid of life when they started out had whale sharks swimming through because there were so many fish. It was worthy of the journey to just feast on these fish living in the kelp forest. The name of the film is 2040.
And people who are interested, his organization is called the Climate Foundation.
I hadn't heard of that film. It sounds like a good watch for sure.
Yes.
Yes. So yeah, and I want to address this question as well. Rachel Collins says, green infrastructure and restoration projects seem like Band-Aids. So the fossil fuel special interests have such a strong hold on the economy. So I'd love for you guys to address that in terms of the concept of, you know, perpetuating fossil fuel infrastructure, et cetera, and what exactly we need. What's the breadth of the solutions that we actually need?
Well, I'll take that. So it's certainly true that the CO2 in our air has largely come from fossil fuel and the fossil fuel infrastructure. Now, the really good news that people are realizing is that the energy from wind and solar and hydro is now considerably less expensive than fossil fuel. And fossil fuel companies are getting out of fossil fuels. The oil companies are going bankrupt and closing. Coal mines are closing. Coal plants are closing. Oil refineries are closing. And the oil companies are shrinking. I know here in Silicon Valley, where I live, probably 1 out of 4 cars now are electric, and that's only going to keep increasing. So the good news is that the oil age is over. It's going to stop, not just like they said, the rock age Stone Age didn't end because of lack of rocks. The Stone Age ended because there was the next thing. The oil age isn't going to end due to lack of oil. It's going to end because it's been replaced by clean energy. And that's happening rapidly. So the most important thing is to rapidly build the alternatives. So if it's possible for you to put solar panels on your house to get an electric car, you should do that as quickly as possible, in part because it advertises to your neighbors that this is important and it's an acceptable thing to do. It was the second part of that question, right?
Oh, Well, I'm afraid I erased the actual question.
Sorry.
I can just
But
add really quickly that one of our mottos at the Foundation for Climate Restoration is there are no enemies on this path. We have yet to meet anyone who doesn't want climate restoration. It's just a matter of getting us all together, contributing in the ways that we can contribute so that we can get there. So even our CEO likes to say, even the oil executives have families, they have kids, they want to see the planet be a livable place, and they need to be able to provide for their families. So one of our jobs at the Foundation for Climate Restoration is to provide opportunities for those oil executives to contribute in a way that, you know, works for their entire business in a way that benefits all of humanity.
So when you say opportunities for them to do that, I'm curious, are you talking about transitioning into other energy sources? Is that?
Yeah, and you know, if they're not ready to transition, then fund the research, fund the policy work. You know, there are so many ways to contribute that, you know, won't be as good as shutting down their oil refining or whatever entirely, but that will make a substantial impact. So part of our job is just showing them what the pathways are so they can find the ones that work for them.
We've gotten great cooperation from Shell Oil, for example. 2 years ago, well, before 2 years ago, there were no models, economic models, showing what would it look like if we got off of oil. There just weren't any, at least not this century. And so I asked Shell Oil to come up with what I called a happy ending scenario. And they did. And it really changed the whole geography of the climate talks, the climate atmosphere, because when Shell Oil says, oh, we actually could get off of oil and go to 100% renewables before the end of the century. When Shell Oil says that, that then became something that everybody knew was true. And they were happy to do that. As Erica said, they have families, they really do care. And it really is important that people treat everyone with respect. It's easy to say, oh, those are the enemies. But when you do that, you actually create enemies. And it's one of the hardest parts of my jobs, my many jobs, is to remind people, work with everybody, especially work with your enemies, because they all have children. And if you treat them like enemies, they're going to think that you're against their children. We don't want that.
So I want to read something from the chat box. It sounds a little bit more like a comment, but I think it's very apropos to exactly what you were saying. From Davefinnegan, how do we change the language surrounding predicting the future? Up to now, following the Al Gore model, we've all been saying, here's how bad it could be if we did everything wrong. But in order to solve the problem, we need to say, here's how great it will be when we do everything right. Let's stop looking at the worst case scenario and look at the best case instead. People freeze with fear, but take action with hope.
Yeah, I like Davefinnegan.
Thank you. That's exactly one of the conversations that we have over and over and over again. And in fact, recently we've been talking about our strategy with messaging has tended to be, let's not bother with how bad everything's going to be, because one, everyone's heard it before, and two, people kind of shut down when you tell them how terrible the future looks. You know, some people will get really motivated, but most people just don't want to hear it. They don't know what to do. It's really overwhelming. So we've been talking about, how do we lead people on a path where they can experience the grief and the worry that they have while on the path towards optimism and hope. So how can we present climate restoration in a way that allows them to experience all the feelings that they've been, you know, trying to hold at arm's length, and get to a place where they have hope for their future? So if you have any ideas, let me know.
I think that's wonderfully put, and I imagine something a lot of us deal with on a regular basis.
Well, one of the key things I'm finding to push that forward is to keep emphasizing that there are no enemies on this path. because if you identify your problem as caused by an enemy, it leaves you a victim and waiting for your enemy to weaken, which could take to the end of time. If you're framing your project like everybody wants the same thing, now you'll get everyone aligned. And if you know if everyone's going in the same direction, you know you're going to get to the destination. So I really encourage everyone to frame the climate issue as an issue that everybody wants a solution to. And for historical reasons, some people ended up getting jobs in mining coal. Yeah, I'm sorry about that, and that happened, but they have kids too. And let's get them all new jobs.
Here's a comment from Jeff Howard I'd like to address. He says, is it really feasible to create technology to sequester carbon dioxide while not halting and reversing deforestation? We have a scalable and practically free technology to sequester carbon in forests, grasslands, etc., but we are accelerating our destruction of these lands, mostly for animal agriculture use, which also greatly contributes to greenhouse gases. While I think we need to explore every avenue for improvement, I wonder what you think about focusing on technology rather than changing our destructive habits.
I'll take that.
Yeah, I love this question. It's a conversation that we have all the time because it's not actually an either or. You know, there are 7.5 billion people on this planet. We can do many things at the same time. So it's obvious that we need to stop our destructive habits. We need to embrace solutions that increase the health of our natural systems. And we need the technology because a lot of those systems, like trees, you know, they're kind of free. You know, it takes money to plant them and maintain them maybe. But they also just take a while to mature enough to sequester any meaningful amount of CO2. They're susceptible to the natural disasters that have been accelerating since because of climate change. So we can't put all of our eggs in that basket, and we need to work with our natural systems as much as we can.
Yeah. I can't believe how much the time is flying by. It's already 5:57 and there are so many fantastic questions in here. And I really do wish we could get to all of them. But I'm afraid we are going to have to wrap it up for time. I wish we could go on forever. What I would like to do is to, I want to make sure that we do get a chance to answer some of these questions, even if we need to reply privately or address them. We will be following up in an email to everyone who registered for the event with a video and with some additional information and links to the Foundation for Climate Restoration for their upcoming events. They also have a page to sign a petition about the importance of changing this target toward climate restoration, giving that positive view of where we can go if we mobilize at the level that we need to go to. So we will be following up with all of those links, and I think that Laura may be putting some of those in the chat too as able. We do have another upcoming event going on for CLIO that I'm looking forward to. NBC6's John Morales, the chief meteorologist there, will be involved in a event on September 17th that would be great for everyone to tune into. We will be following up with that information to register for that event as well. But I'm afraid we need to wrap things up because it's 5:59 now. Thank you everyone so much. It's been really great to speak with you, Peter and Erica, and these fantastic questions were really great. Thank you everyone for contributing the questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything now, but anything anyone else wants to add before we head off?
I'll say thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting us. Thank you everyone for listening. These are fantastic questions. I wish we could have gotten to more of them.
Really great questions. I know. Hopefully we can do a little follow-up and get some answers so that we can respond to people. with some of the answers we couldn't get to. Yeah. Okay,
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
great.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Bye.